Hello and welcome to Star USA Training. Today is Tuesday, October 8th, and we're talking about export control classification numbers and licensing under the Export Administration Regulations. This webinar is being recorded. The slides, materials, and all additional handouts will be posted on our website following the presentation. It'll take a few days for us to process the recording, so please be patient. We will send an email to everyone that registered. So you'll get that as soon as the content is posted on our site. There is an NCBFAA code at the end of the webinar, and this session is eligible for 1 continuing education credit. Please feel free to make use of the webinar software to submit your questions, and we'll carve out time in the back to try and unpack those and get you on the right path to solving your problems. A word of caution as we jump in: while I am a licensed customs broker, nothing today should be construed as transacting customs business on your behalf, and neither is this legal advice. All right, with all that said, we're going to jump in. First up, some quick introductions. My name is Michael D. Easton. I am the President and General Manager of Star USA. I am a licensed customs broker, and I've been in this industry for over 20 years. I am a huge trade compliance nerd, and Star USA is a fantastic resource for anyone looking to develop strategies or solve immediate problems with their international trade and compliance arenas. We handle all manner of international trade and compliance activities, some of which are listed here. So feel free to peruse that at your own leisure or check out our website at starusa.org. And as we kind of talk through today, I want you to kind of lean on my 20 years of experience and ask me whatever questions you can. If I don't know the answer, I will tell you I don't know the answer. I consider that to be okay in this industry. So just feel free to reach out and use us as a resource. So when we're talking about exporting, one of the things I want to make sure that everyone understands as we go into it is that exporting is a privilege. It is not a right. There is no guarantee in Bill of Rights or the Constitution that says you're allowed to export. With any privilege, there are penalties associated with non-compliance. You have responsibilities in order to maintain your privilege. One of those penalties can be revocation of your export privileges. You can be denied from being able to export your goods. Secondly, exporters must be able to demonstrate their compliance. Knowing that you did the right things is not sufficient in the eyes of the government. You must be able to demonstrate that you've done your due diligence. Usually that's through documentation and through other evidence that supports your positions. But when it comes to export controls and what we're talking about today, recognizing the extreme importance of record keeping and processes written down, all of those pieces that build an export compliance program are very, very useful if there is ever an issue. I don't want to scare anyone, and neither does the government. In fact, their intention is to increase exports. The government wants U.S. companies to export their goods and reduce that trade deficit and promote commerce in the U.S. But when it comes to certain categories of goods, there are very strict controls over what is allowed to be exported. Additionally, there's controls over who may receive those exports. We'll talk about some of that today and how that all kind of shapes up, but recognizing that there are non-compliance penalties and risks associated with exporting is essential to doing it correctly. The first thing we're going to talk about is really just to set the stage for what the export environment looks like from a compliance perspective, from a controls perspective. We're going to hit the agencies and areas of control across the spectrum so that we can see where the export administration regulations fit into the overall exporting and regulatory environment for exports. Throughout the slides, there will be many resources and references with hyperlinks. Again, when you receive the materials, you'll be able to use these slides as a resource for you every day. That's kind of the intention with a lot of these slides. As we go through the next several, I don't intend to read every word on there. My expectation is that you'll all kind of make use of the slides in whatever way fits your needs down the line. So with that being said, one of the first areas of consideration for export regulations are the foreign trade regulations. These are what I call the export compliance zone of regulations. This is the U.S. Census Bureau as part of the Department of Commerce. And when we look at the different departments here, you'll understand kind of the escalation in responsibility and oversight. Commerce, their focus is on encouraging export and business internationally. And the Census Bureau is focused on collecting facts and information. So this is where the electronic export information filing rules live, the automated export system or the AES, the ACE stuff, routed and non-routed transactions. All of that is tied up with the foreign trade regulations. This is dealing with the actual exportation, the movement of the cargo out of the country. And that's not what we're going to be talking about today. What we're talking about for today are the export controls of the Bureau of Industry and Security, the BIS. The agency here has gone through some name changes over the years, but they've been BIS for at least a dozen years now. And the BIS is also part of the Department of Commerce, and their intent is to encourage trade, except they're trying to exercise more control over certain categories of goods and under certain controls that exist for various parties. The Export Administration Regulations, the EAR, sometimes called the EAR, are found in 15 CFR Chapter 7, Subchapter C, Part 730 through 774. If you're not already familiar with how the regulations work or how they're constructed, a lot of this might be a challenge to navigate on your own. That's okay. It's not supposed to be immediately apparent if this is your first time, but you really should get some assistance in navigating these things if you're not quite familiar with the regulations. The regs do lay out the majority of the responsibilities and the methods for achieving them. And in addition, the BIS and the Bureau of Census and the Department of Commerce as a whole publishes a lot of information to help you comply with the regulations. Their intention is that you comply so that they do not have to enforce any penalties or other actions against exporters. They want to promote exporting. That's their primary intention. But they want to do so in a safe way for U.S. interests. So the Export Administration Regulations is where you'll find things like Export Control Reform Act rules, the Commerce Control List and ECCNs, which is the main focus of today's session, the general prohibitions, which we'll talk about a bit. Anti-boycott, we will not get into, but we will hit deemed exports. And these links here, again, are references for you to continue to build out your understanding following this session and to help support your understanding of this session later on down the road. Obviously, I understand that hearing a person talk over a webinar is not necessarily going to bring you mastery of any of these things, but that's why these links are here, is to help you understand where to go to get the help that you need. At the bottom of each of these pages, too, I have the penalties and the voluntary self-disclosure environments. I won't be covering self-disclosures or penalties in any great detail here, but those are important to recognize that each of these have their own universes for applying them. Which brings us to our third agency of control here, which is the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, the DDTC. We're no longer in the Department of Commerce. We've moved to the Department of State. And the Department of State is concerned with foreign policy and national security interests and that sort of environment. Here we're in 22 CFR Subchapter M. And this is where you'll find the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or sometimes called ITAR. This is dealing with military and defense articles, United States munitions list, significant military equipment. This was also impacted by the Export Control Reform Act from 2018, as well as the Arms Export Control Act. And there are quite a bit of layers to ITAR. Typically, ITAR is the highest degree of control over specific items within this standard universe of export controls. And we won't be going into ITAR today, and licensing for ITAR is completely separate from the licensing that we're talking about under the EAR. So keep that in mind, that ITAR is a different ball of wax from what we're dealing with today. And the fourth agency I'm going to hit directly is the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, their sanctions and embargoes programs. This is Department of Treasury, and when you hear Treasury, you should be thinking money and financing and things of that nature, because that's where these things live. This is 31 CFR Subtitle B, Chapter 5. Here you'll hear often things like the IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, as well as executive orders impacting our ability to trade freely with other countries. As the war in Ukraine has ramped up over the last few years, more and more executive orders have come out to restrict trade with and sanction Russia and for their activities there. And OFAC administers those sanctions programs. They publish the standards that you're supposed to meet, and it's up to you to understand how that sanction, how that order is written as it applies to your business. So there's some interpretation that has to happen, and it does fluctuate often. The OFAC also publishes the Specially Designated Nationals List, the SDN list, which names individuals that are subject to denial orders and may not be recipients of exports. And there are other lists maintained by other agencies. In fact, the BIS consolidates those lists into the consolidated screening list that makes it a little bit more accessible on a bulk scale. But again, we won't be going through OFAC or how their rules are applied within the scope of today, just recognizing that they do apply in all cases. Additionally, there are other agencies that have influence over exports, and one of them is CBP. At the border, they enforce all of the export regulations. They will seize cargo. They're the ones that are actually at the borders, and they have the most significant manpower of any of those agencies. And there are other agencies that have explicit control over certain categories of export. When we're talking about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or the Drug Enforcement Administration, Department of Energy, all of these players have explicit controls over certain categories of goods. We also have to be aware of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the State Foreign Military Sales Program. There are plenty more, and that link on this slide will take you to the BIS version of the and more, but just recognizing that the universe is very, very broad. These regulations are additive. You kind of have to work with them all at the same time, depending on what your situation is. So you have to recognize which ones are going to apply in your situation without ignoring any of them. So that's the environment that we're in. Now we need to understand, since we know where the EAR fits into the equation, which is effectively one step above export compliance, but one step below United States munitions lists. What does that mean? And we're going to talk about the exports and areas of control, the dual use nature of these goods, and deemed exports, as well as a few other facts here as we kind of start to build the understanding of where these things fit in together. So who is responsible for exercising controls? Under the EAR, we're talking about all exporters. Those are the people that are actually exporting the goods. We're also talking about all parties to the export transaction. If you're a party to the transaction, you have an expectation of exercising control within the EAR universe. Additionally, the regulations will apply to all parties with knowledge of the export transaction. In practice, that means that there is no defense for not knowing when you should have known. The term that the EAR uses is willful blindness, and that applies to all parties who had reason to know of the export transaction as well. If you're supposed to know and you chose not to, or you just did not choose to inform yourself, you can still be held responsible for violations of the Export Administration regulations. There's no practical defense for allowing these categories of goods to fall into the hands of individuals that are not supposed to have them as far as the government is concerned. And they do issue severe penalties for willful blindness. And in fact, the BIS publishes a document called Don't Let This Happen to You, which is a fantastic read. They update it about annually. The most recent update was in March of this year, and it will detail the names of the companies that violated the regulations, the degree of penalty that they were issued, including a revocation of privileges, either on a temporary or an extended basis, as well as the circumstances of the transaction. The BIS is not shy about naming and shaming people who violate the regulations. That publication I'll make sure to provide in the handouts and materials that will go onto our website, so you'll have that for reference. But recognizing that anybody that has the ability to know should be exercising the controls properly. Which leads us to what exports are controlled under the EAR. And the scope here is broad. The Foreign Trade Regulations, the FTR, which is Bureau of Census, is only concerned with physical goods that are exported. But under the Export Administration Regulations and ITAR and OFAC, exports include any item in U.S. trade, including goods, services, technology, and information. So not just physical items, but also information associated with those physical items. Those can also be controlled. Services that you provide, particularly defense services or things related to the operation or usage of certain technologies that are controlled. The EAR also controls U.S. items wherever located, even goods located abroad. That means if they've already been exported, let's say they went to a distributor in Europe, and as far as you know, that's the end of the supply chain. But in reality, those goods are being re-exported to other players in other parts of the world. And if they eventually make their way into the hands of an entity that is not supposed to have them without a license, then that violation can trace back all the way to the original exporter from the US. So US items, wherever located, are still subject to these rules and these controls. And that's something that a lot of people forget or neglect to recognize is you can't just sell to a distributor overseas and wash your hands of it when it comes to these items. You have to have an understanding of where the goods are going to be used, who's going to be using them, and how. Other exports that are controlled are deemed exports. We'll have a slide on that in a moment, or I'll explain what deemed exports means. Defense services, technical data, and foreign direct products are also controlled within the EAR. When creating policies, procedures, practices within your organization, policies, and establishing communication channels with your provider network or your customer base, ensuring that they have an active understanding of these rules and regulations when they apply to those goods is essential to actually maintaining compliance with these regulations. And that can be a difficult ask, and it requires people having buy-in. And I'm fully cognizant of the challenges that that presents, but it is an angle that has to be understood and navigated on an active basis. It's not going to be a passive set it and forget it kind of thing. There are some things that are not controlled, typically things that are in the public domain, as well as some artistic or non-technical publications like sheet music or children's books or calendars, things like that. But by and large, most things are going to be controlled and subject to the EAR. And the EAR is focused on dual use goods. Goods that are dual use, it means that they have both a civil or commercial use in addition to a military or a terrorism or a WMD related application. They can have multifunction, and things that are only used for military or WMD or things of that nature are going to be typically covered under ITAR, under the International Traffic in Arms regulations. But things that can be used for multi-purpose for civil and military application are considered to be dual use. And that's what the Commerce Control List and the ECCN environment is meant to categorize and approach. And we'll dig deeper and deeper into that. Some examples of things that are dual use controlled. The Sony PlayStation, the PS2 requires a military license from Japan because of the processor's capabilities. And in fact, the U.S. Air Force famously built a supercomputer out of over 1,700 daisy-chained PS3s because of the unique properties for cooling and for image processing. They built a massive array of these PS3s that rivaled any technology that they could get at a fraction of the price, which makes these PlayStations dual use in this case because they're being used for military purposes, even though they were intended for commercial use. I have a PS3. I've never used it for a military purpose, but lo and behold, it is controlled, and I should not export that without getting the proper licenses. Additionally, things like dental drills are controlled. Some of the gyroscopes in certain types of dental drills can be used in missiles. So that gyroscopic propulsion and properties can be very useful to actors that need to get their hands on these things that are having a hard time doing it. They'll buy a bunch of dental drills, take them apart, and install them into missiles in order to get the sort of capabilities out of them that they want. Fax machines, the very, very popular and still active today telecommunication device, have relays in them that can be used to remotely detonate IEDs. In fact, they were rampant during the war in Afghanistan. People were finding cell phones with these telecom relays attached to the outside, strapped to C4 and other explosives, and they were using these relays to trigger the device based on a phone call coming in, and it was devastating. So these devices are controlled. In this fax machine case, and even in the other two, if you'll see here, they're selling dental drills or fax machines. The relay or the gyroscope that's part of those things is what's controlled, not the actual drill. So knowing what's in the components is also relevant. What comprises the finished good or what ends up getting shipped is only a piece of the equation. You have to have the entire understanding of the product and its potential capabilities. And that can get very, very complicated as you navigate the commerce control list and trying to understand which components, either that you're manufacturing yourself or that you're buying domestically, that may have that dual use consideration. And the onus is on the exporter to identify those things prior to export. I will note, hopping back real quick, for dual use goods, the design or intended use is not relevant to the equation here. There is the concept of specially designed within the regulations. It is a defined term, and I won't have time to go into how that works today. It's very, very involved in how you navigate that. But the intention behind the goods is not as relevant as what it's actually capable of. What the fact is more important than what the intention was. A deemed export is the release of controlled technology, software, or information to a non-US citizen. That release is considered an export to that individual's home country. And releases can occur from things like tours of facilities that use controlled technologies, allowing someone to inspect diagrams or schematics of controlled tech, instructing someone on how to use a controlled technology, giving a presentation about a controlled technology, and sharing source codes that contain or control a controlled technology. So I'm giving a presentation right now, and there are presumably some non-US citizens in the audience. If I were to be disclosing any controlled information to you, I would be in violation of the regulations. Luckily, I'm not going to do that, so I won't have that risk. But even talking about these things, phone calls have gotten people in trouble in the past. One of the common scenarios where people get tripped up on deemed exports is our universities. Professors will often have teaching assistants, and those professors will be, working on defense-related projects, and they will be leveraging the support from their TAs to help them with the projects that they're working on, either as a consultant or as a design spec or some other facet of it. And sharing that information with those individuals is deemed to be an export to that person's home country, and professors have gone to prison for releasing technology that they should not have. Another case that we had was a US-based manufacturer was manufacturing a small piece of metal that ended up being intended for use on a rocket. The customer that actually makes the rocket was in the UK, but they needed the special properties from this one manufacturer here in the US that could do this in a special way to make this shielding piece that goes into that part of that rocket. And all that was coming out of the US was just this piece of metal. But that communication with the UK buyer, again, they're the ones that are creating the specification, but sharing any sort of specs with them was considered a release of that technology. Sharing any insight into how those things are manufactured, allowing them to come in and inspect the manufacturing process, even for QA purposes, all of that was controlled. And they needed a license in order to even engage in some of those conversations because they were releasing that technology to a foreign national. So being aware of how those things come into play, and when you're working with your customers, if you're telling them how your devices work or providing them with specifications as part of your sales pitch, and they're a foreign national, they're a non-US citizen, then you are considered to be releasing that information to them. And your salespeople really need to be instructed on how not to release controlled technology. And again, we're only focusing on controlled technologies, and we haven't quite gotten into what is controlled and what is not, but if it is a non-controlled technology, you can tell people whatever you like. You're not going to run afoul of these regulations here. Okay, so that's some of the frameworks that exist within the EAR. And now we're going to take a look at the ECCNs, the Commerce Control List, and the country chart. And typically this is where people have a bad joke about the country music charts and the country chart from the CCL, and ha ha ha, good job. I couldn't think of a good joke, so there we go. The first question most people try and understand is how they obtain an ECCN. There are three basic methods. One is consult the actual original manufacturer. You can request that the manufacturer provide you an ECCN, and many of them have robust export control programs internally and have already done all the legwork on goods that they manufacture. And you can rely to a degree on their determinations, or at least their methodologies for determinations. You still have an obligation as the exporter to ensure that you obtain the license and that the ECCN assigned to that good is actually accurate. But you can refer to sometimes people have it on their websites. Microsoft Collins Aerospace has information on their website. The BIS has an info table. It's woefully out of date. I know BIS is trying to update their website, and I'm hoping that they will have a more current version of this reference sheet. But there's a whole list of companies that either provide a website reference or at least a point of contact for obtaining ECCNs on the goods that they manufacture. So you can take a shortcut there if you're not the manufacturer, and you can go directly to the manufacturer to get some information. The other way, more commonly, is self-classification, and we'll dig into that here in a moment on how that works. But most exporters will classify the goods that they're exporting, whether they're the manufacturer or they're just a reseller or they're using a component from a different manufacturer, whatever the case may be. Typically, if the manufacturer does not provide the classification, then you're going to be responsible for classifying it yourself, at least to some degree. Additionally, you can go to the BIS and ask them to classify the good for you. Part of that process involves telling them what you think the ECCN should be, explaining all the product information to them. That's through the Commodity Classification Automated Tracking System, the CCATS, and they will assign an ECCN as appropriate and give you a CCATS number to use for references in future exports, and so on and so forth. And in fact, Microsoft's website has the CCATS numbers listed with any of the products that they have gotten CCATS determinations on. But the rules for that are in 15 CFR 748.3, and you can use the SnapR as well as this BIS guidance tool that they've put together. Again, that's on their old website, so that may not work sometime in the future, but who knows when. It's always fun when governments change websites. What are export control classification numbers? Where do they come from? How do you use them? So the ECCN numbers are based on the 1995 Wassenaar arrangement, which is implemented in 42 countries, including in North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, South Africa, and more. So 42 countries recognize this sort of coding system. It bears mentioning, for anyone that's unfamiliar with export controls in this environment, ECCNs have nothing to do with the HS code. There may be some cross-reference tools that are meant to provide you some sort of kind of guidance on where you might want to start looking for an ECCN if you have the HS code. Just like there are some, if you have a CAS number for a chemical, you can kind of get in a certain ballpark potentially, but there is no direct relationship. There is no direct correlation between HS codes and ECCN codes or classifications. So the harmonized classification and ECCNs are different things entirely. In fact, ECCNs are alphanumeric codes, whereas the HTS is just a numeric code. Those alphanumeric codes are broken down into 10 categories, although there's actually 11, and the counting starts at 0 and goes up to 9, but there's 2 parts to 5. So there's 10 categories that they say 10 categories in the regs, but there's actually 11 on the list and whatever. So just keep that in mind. If you hear people say that there are 11 categories, I might say it. There are these numbered ones here on the top left image: nuclear materials, facilities and equipment, materials processing, electronics, navigation, avionics, marine, aerospace, and propulsion. Those categories are then broken down. Every single category is then broken down into one of 5 product groups. These 5 product groups are A through E, and they cover the end items, equipment, accessories, parts, and components in A, inspection and test in production equipment in B, materials, and then software, and then technology. All ECCNs are going to begin with that category and then go into a product code. And then there's going to be 3 additional digits that are for the reasons of control. We'll take a look at that here on this slide in a moment. Actually, I can do that right now. Whoops, that's too far. There we go. So the suffixes here are broken down to help group the reasons for control and kind of keep similar goods grouped together. They have a similar reason to be controlled. And the reasons for control are there on the screen. You've got missile technology, national security, nuclear nonproliferation, firearms, so on and so forth. All of those kind of help inform what the last three digits of the ECCN are. And there are suffixes, which we'll look at in a moment, that specify a particular item within that category, group, and three-digit reason for control. But loosely speaking, a 2D290 means that it's in the category of materials processing, which is category 2, which you can see on the screen there. Again, it's the third category, but it's category number 2. The group is software, which is group D, and the reason for control for 290 is nuclear nonproliferation. So it kind of helps paint a picture. You can tell by an ECCN where it's going to be followed and why it's going to be controlled if you're familiar with these terms. Any good that is subject to the EAR but does not have an ECCN number is considered to be EAR 99. That's for goods that are subject to the EAR but are subject to the EAR but are not listed on the Commerce Control List. This is all of your generic non-risky goods, a simple pen or a piece of plastic that has no particular properties that fall within the Commerce Control List, or all kinds of goods, paper, all kinds of things are considered to be EAR 99. Only the dual use goods are given that export control classification number, or at least only certain goods that are within these categories and product groups that are specified are going to have an ECCN number assigned to them. If you have a good that is EAR 99, you will not need a license from the Commerce Control List classification. You may still need a license for other reasons, if it's for a specific end user or for a specific end use or to a particular country or region that is controlled for other reasons that is outside of the ECCN classification. You may still need a license, but EAR 99 goods typically will not need a license through the ECCN Commerce Control List classification process. BIS does publish the structure of the CIL to help kind of guide you through how this stuff works, as well as the Commerce Control List order of review. I find those resources to be only moderately useful. It helps to already be familiar with how the machine works before you start to dive into the BIS's guidance on how to use those machines, the machine of classifying. You'll see that pop up often in the regulations. I'll say that a few times on this session. Subject to the EAR means loosely that an item is not otherwise exclusively controlled by another agency. If it's controlled by ITAR, then it's not subject to the EAR. If it's controlled exclusively by ITAR, it would not be subject to the EAR, it would be subject to the ITAR. And basically anything that's not exclusively controlled by another agency is going to be subject to the EAR. Hopefully that makes sense. Here's how we apply the EAR wording, the actual Commerce Control List in practice. I'm going to kind of walk through it so you can see the different parts and understand the construction of the ECCN number, so it makes a little bit more sense and you can start to use this a little bit more practically on your end. You start with the category at the top. It's going to be 0 through 9, and then it goes into the product group. Here, product groups which are A through E. This example we have here is an A: end items, equipment, accessories, attachments, parts, components, and systems. You'll notice there's a lot of quotes around all of those words, basically. That's not because we have a quote-happy person typing these things up. That's because that word is specifically defined in the EAR. That term or that phrase is specifically defined. And there's a definitions link at the end of this on the resources where you can actually see how the EAR defines these words. Every single one of these words that has a quote around it throughout the entirety of the Commerce Control List is defined in the regulations. And you're supposed to use those definitions in your interpretation of what these words mean. Attachments and parts and components and systems have specific meanings, so you have to use those definitions when navigating it. The Commerce Control List did not always have those quotes. I'm very glad that they added them because it helps point people to the understanding that there is a specific meaning behind that word. Once you've got the category and the product group, then you move into the heading and type of control, which is highlighted there. Hopefully that's clear. In this case, we're looking at a 4A004 where it covers computers as follows and specially designed related equipment, electronic assemblies, and components therefore. And again, we've got three quoted phrases in here: specially designed, electronic assemblies, and components. Those are all defined in the AR. We should cross-reference those definitions when applying this ECCN to our item. After you move out of the heading and type of control, you get to the license requirements and the reasons for control and the country chart reference. So in this instance, the license requirements and the reason for control are NS, stands for national security. RS stands for regional stability, and it applies to 4A004.Z. And there's some additional country chart considerations that we'll need to factor in when we look at the country chart if we are in that 4A004.Z. And then the last reason for control is AT, which is anti-terrorism, and it applies to the entire entry for AT column 1. So those are the reasons for control. And these things are very relevant. We'll see how they tie in a moment, but I have to move through the rest of this ECCN number here. So after we have those reasons for control and the country chart reference, we look at the license exceptions. These are all spelled out in 15 CFR Part 740. I have a slide on them later as well. But you can have an exception here under this ECCN for LVS for $5,000. LVS stands for limited value shipments. So under $5,000, or you may not use the LVS, not applicable for 4A004.Z. The GBS exception is not applicable. That's the country group B shipments. That's GBS. That code is GBS. And NAC, you can use that exception for 4A004.Z, but not for any other 4A004 commodities. So the parts that we're looking at, the only exception that applies is the LVS exception that applies for these items that are controlled down here. So this is the list of items controlled. We've gotten through the category, the group, the heading, the reasons for control, and the exceptions. And now we get to see which items are controlled within that computers as follows definition. And they start to specify them. There are related controls here, so we would refer to ECCN 4A090 for additional context of related controls on similar items. We would also see Note 4 to ECCN 3A090. I'm not going to go through all those, but they're directing us to go look at each of these other places that are outside the scope of 4A004, but have related application to 4A004 or may have a more specific call out here. There are no related definitions that are not otherwise already identified. And the items that are being controlled start with item A, which is systolic array computers, item B, which is neural computers, and item C, optical computers. And it goes on from there, which there's not room on the slide to really capture all of those things. And it ends at 4A004.Z. That's kind of what the Commerce Control List, that CCL, this is what it looks like and how to read it. Hopefully that connects and it makes some sense. And indeed, 4A004.B describes computers as follows and specially designed related equipment, electronic assemblies, and components, therefore, of neural computers. That's how you would read that. The Commerce Control List is available as supplement number 1 to Part 774. There's a couple of different ways to view it from that link. You can see it as kind of this columnar chart that's in the regs as it's published, or you can see it as a web page. There's a lot of different ways you can use it. I know it's very high level, and I apologize, but the limited time and availability to cover all these bases. So once we've got our ECCN number, we need to now go look at the country list. This is our country chart, and cross-reference the country of our destination with the reasons for control from the ECCN to determine if we need a license or not. So we're going to take a look at our example ECCN from just a moment ago, 4A004.B, which was controlled for NS2 and AT1. If we flip back just real quick, there is an RS, a reason for control on here for regional stability, but it only applies to 4A004.Z. So we're not worried about that for our 4A004.B. We only have national security column 2 and anti-terrorism column 1 to look at. So first, we find our countries, and we're going to ship it to 2 countries. We're going to ship it to Aruba and Belgium. I chose those 2 countries because they're both on the chart on one page, and I don't have to look at all the other countries. But you can see all the countries in that supplement number 1 to Part 738, linked at the top of the slide. So we take our countries, Aruba and Belgium, and then we cross-reference with our reasons for control using this column at the top. And we start to kind of dial in to what we need. There's Aruba, there's Belgium, here's NS2, and here's AT1 columns. And then we look at the intersections, and we have an X for Aruba in column NS2, and no X's for Belgium in that column, and no X's for either Aruba or Belgium. So if I'm shipping for Aruba or Belgium in the anti-terrorism column, if I'm shipping these goods to Belgium, I do not need a license. If I'm shipping the goods to Aruba, I do need a license for NS2, National Security Column 2 reasons. And I would have to go through the license application process. We take the ECCN, look at the reasons for control. That reasons for control box right here is going to tell us what we need to look at. And then we take it to the country chart, do some cross-referencing, and identify which ones have the X, and that's the one that we need a license if we're going to ship there. We still need to declare the ECCN on our electronic export information filing, the EEI, but you do not need to apply for and receive a license. You just need to declare the ECCN if you're not going to Aruba or any of those other NS2 column countries. So now that we know what the ECCNs are and how to know if we need a license under the ECCN framework, we need to know what we're talking about when we talk about going to get a license. So what do you get a license for? I mentioned this earlier, but there are controlled items, technology, and information. If you don't know where your controls are, you can get a commodities jurisdiction determination from the DDTC that will tell you if it's controlled by ITAR or if it's not ITAR, if it's one of the other agencies. And if it's none of the other agencies, then it's going to be potentially EAR, and the BIS will weigh in. And that's how you know which items, technology, and information are going to be controlled. That goes for any defense goods and services, significant military equipment, dual-use goods, ECCNs, and CCL. Those can all be controlled and licensable things that need a license. You may also need a license for certain prohibited destinations or for any sanctions and embargoed countries or regions or uses that may exist. This is where you would bring in the country chart. You would look at the OFAC sanctions and embargoes programs, review any executive orders that might apply, and consider your destination control statements. I can't go into all of those things. I wish I could, and I would be happy to following the webinar if anybody wants to ask questions. But those destinations and for any sanctioned or embargoed program that exists out there, you would need a license. And lastly, there are end users and parties to the transaction that may require a license, regardless of what it is or regardless of where it's going, if it's a specifically named person. This is where the consolidated screening list and especially designated nationals come into play. Things like denial orders might be in the equation. Anybody handling the goods along the way, any financial institutions that are handling payment for the goods, if there are certain consolidators or distributors or warehouses involved or forwarders that are on these lists or that are prohibited in some other way, all of those things would require a license. So you could need a license for any of these different reasons, sometimes multiple. And knowing if you need a license or not is your responsibility by knowing what's going on with your transaction. We're going to take a look at the general prohibitions here. These are spelled out in the Export Administration Regulations, and these are the overarching kind of mandates that the EAR expects you to adhere to. The prohibitions, there's 10 in number, and they get into more detail on the regs, but loosely, General Prohibition 1 is dealing with the export and re-export of controlled items to listed countries, which that's the country chart. U.S. content re-exports from abroad, that's U.S. goods wherever located. Those are going to be controlled. Even if they're already in a foreign country, they're still under U.S. export controls. Foreign direct product rules and the inclusion of controlled foreign products in U.S. technologies or in the possession of U.S. persons, those will be controlled. Any actions prohibited by a denial order are controlled. Any end use or end user restrictions, those are controlled. Any embargo destinations, proliferation and military intelligence end uses and end users, any in-transit prohibitions, which basically state that you cannot go through certain prohibited countries. So the routing of your shipment becomes relevant and the ships are stopping over in Iran that contain your goods. That's going to be prohibited if it's a controlled technology and for other reasons. Violations of orders, terms, and conditions, either as applied to the contracts that you issue or those circumstances there. And then knowledge of violations that have occurred or are about to occur. So if you have knowledge of violations, effectively, each of these things is prohibited under the Export Administration Regulations. goes into a lot of detail. I can't hit it all today, but hopefully there's enough reference and understanding there of what is controlled. And so this will inform what we need to know going into our export control decision making by looking at whether or not our goods are subject to the EAR. And this flow chart is published by the BIS. It's available in the regulations as Supplement 1 to Part 732. But loosely, you need to know if your good is subject to the EAR or if it's subject to some other agency's controls. What is your product in the ECCN classification? What is the destination that it's going to and the routing? Who is the ultimate end user? What is the ultimate end use? And are there any license exceptions that apply? And as you kind of have all the information, you navigate this flow chart and you either arrive at no license required, not part of the EAR, license exception applies, or you need to get a license. Those are kind of the only options. It's not part of the EAR, so you need to look at ITAR or a different agency. It is part of the EAR, but no license is required. It is part of the EAR, and a license would be required, but there's a license exception in the instance that you're using. And lastly, yes, there is part of the EAR, and yes, a license is required, and you must get one before you can export it. The license exceptions codes are here. I'm not going to review all of these, but there are a series. The LVS shipment is often used in the shipments of limited value, and the strategic trade authorization exceptions are frequently used, but also frequently misused, probably by nature of them being frequently used. Knowing how and when these can apply and what the limitations of these are, and which ECCNs are allowed to use these exceptions and to what extent, is all part of knowing how to apply for the licenses properly. And these are all spelled out in 15 CFR Part 740. Okay, so then now that we know all of that, who applies or who can apply for the license? It would be applied for either by the USPPI or an authorized agent, as defined in CFR 30.3 or 748.4A. The person applying for the license must be in the US when completing the application process. You may not be located abroad and apply for a license under any circumstance. If you need to apply for a license, where do you begin? Start with 15 CFR 748 as well as Supplement 1 to 748 and 750 as well. Those lay out the parameters and the process that you would go through. As you go through the license process, if you want to appeal the decision, you would refer to 756 for that information. 758 tells you how to use the license during the actual exportation of the product. You need to get the license well in advance of the export occurring. You won't be able to get one, overnight. That's not a thing that happens. I believe the BIS tries to hit a 30 days or less mark, and in many cases they can be successful, especially if you follow the parameters and process from 748 to a T and are very, very comprehensive. It will often expedite how quickly you get your license determination back. If the BIS does not have to ask for more information, that's very helpful. If you do not provide enough information, they will return your application without action, RWA, which basically says start over and resubmit. And you don't want to be in that position because then you go back to the bottom of the queue typically. And you register for and submit your applications via the SnapR system. That's the website interface for basically navigating that application, that license application process. And generally, what do you need to include? The names and addresses, or at least be prepared to include names and addresses of all parties to the transaction, information on all products. There's a 6 max limit, although you can get that to be more than 6 depending on the circumstances of the products if they're closely related enough. Information including the ECCN, the quantity, the values, the parties to the transaction, the technical information, brochures, uses in commerce, expectations for end users, all that information, you would put that into the application process, as well as any support documents that are required, often by particular products. They're going to have additional documentation needs. And you would also provide an end user or end use statement. You can use the BIS Form 711 for that, or you can put one on your own letterhead that covers all of the same relevant information that the BIS Form 711 does, but doesn't look quite as official. For our clients, I tend to advise them to use the Form 711 when they want to look a little bit more official to a certain customer that they are suspicious of. And when they are just doing it as a routine thing that they're gathering, then go ahead and put it on their own, just as a way to smooth the process out. That brings us to our parting thoughts here. As I said at the top, the whole of the EAR is much, much, much broader than just the Commerce Control List and just the ECCNs. Anti-boycott regulations alone are its own topic to review and understand how those are being applied, as well as recognizing that there have been recent enforcement actions taken for anti-boycott violations. The anti-boycott risk was relatively low for a while, but it has climbed in recent years with the events going on in Israel and Gaza in that area. The definitions of the quoted terms are in Part 772. I can't overstate how important those definitions are, especially the specially designed definition, which is very, very difficult to navigate. I would probably do an entire webinar on just the definition of specially designed. It's a convoluted process. The recording slides and additional handouts will be posted on our website in the coming days. I do have like 7 or 8 additional handouts for anybody that's a super nerd out there if you want to kind of dig deeper into this stuff. And again, there's 100 links in these slides that you can make use of as well. And then lastly, we have additional resources on our webpage that are related to this, specifically our routed exports webinar that we did earlier this year, our sanctions anti-boycott, our export screening, and our disclosures webinars that cover a lot of similar ground that we didn't cover in this webinar that is still relevant. So please feel free to check those out. Thank you very much for your time and support. Please stick around for the Q&A. The code, if you need it, is on the screen there, and I'm going to leave that up. Thank you again, everyone, for your time, and I will stop the recording now, and we will do Q&A. Thank you very much.